Let's talk about More's proof of an external world as the second of our three papers that we're going to look at by G.E. More. This paper is late in More's life. It was published in 1939, and it was delivered as a lecture on the occasion of his retirement at Cambridge. So in one sense, I guess it's the culmination of his attitudes and work in epistemology and metaphysics. But for us, theoretically speaking, it provides a nice bridge. The first paper was The Refutation of Idealism. Proof of an external world lies at the interface of metaphysics and epistemology. As we will see, it is both a proof of an external world and a discussion about the nature of proof and the epistemological aspects that need to be met in order to develop a proof of anything. So here's a picture of G.E. More when he was relatively young. We'll turn in the third paper to A Defense of Common Sense, which is from 1925, where he's summarizing his epistemological views in significant detail. But for today, let's talk about proof of an external world. So the first thing to see is early and late G.E. More. So this is, the second picture is more what he looked like when he actually gave this lecture. And there's an intermediate picture of More as well. I don't know how old he is in that. It looks to me like he's in his perhaps 50s. And here's one of the most intriguing pictures of all. I don't know who this guy is on the left. I'm not sure. But in the middle is our philosopher of the day, G.E. More, and this is John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist and confirmation theory person. It's an interesting fact that intellectual life at Cambridge was broadly interdisciplinary at the time. So More and Keynes were close friends, close colleagues. In any case, let's take a look at the paper. Now, the first thing to notice about the paper is it begins with the laborious groundwork that we noticed in The Refutation of Idealism. So we first have to spend a long time analyzing the claim, things outside of us. Are there really things outside of us? More says when we talk about things outside of us, we might be talking about external things, things external to us, things external to our minds, things to be met with in space, and he talks about each of these possible interpretations in some detail. The culmination of this work takes us to this. Things to be met with is not the same concept as the concept of things presented in space, because things presented in space is wider than things to be met with in space. So he's thinking about negative after images, double images, pain after images in general. And met with is also wider than presented. That which is to be met with in space is that which might be presented, not that which in fact is presented. In any case, after laying all of this groundwork, he then outlines a proof strategy. What will it take to show that there is an external world? Kant famously said it was a scandal to philosophy that we couldn't prove that there was an external world. Here's what More has to say about the proof strategy. If we can prove that there are such things as tables, plants, animals, stars, houses, or whatever, that would be a good starting point, because from the existence of such things, it follows that there are things to be met with in space. And that's the proper understanding of the notion of an external world. He then points out, in particular, we don't need to give a separate proof that the implication in B, in fact, is an implication of the sort claimed, for that would generate an infinite regress. Now, this is a really important point, one that's often overlooked. When you look at what skeptics typically try to do when they're trying to convince you that you don't know anything, is they'll ask you the question, how do you know? And let P be the object that you know. How do you know that you're not dreaming? How do you know that Trump lost the election? Whatever it is. How do you know these things? And in response to that, you will cite a reason. How do I know that P? Here's my reason. Now, as soon as you say that, the skeptic is inclined to jump a level in precisely the way that Moore identifies. Here's how you do it. The skeptic says you cited R as a reason for P. But how do you know that if R is true, then P is true? Or how do you know that R is a reason, a good reason for P? How do you know that? Now notice these two questions are not the same. The first is, explain to me how you know that P. When you cite R, then the skeptic shifts and says, well, what makes you think P has to be true if R is true? Or what makes P likely to be true if R is true? Notice this is a meta question in relation to this, the one we started with. The one we started with was a first order question. How do you know that P? Now suppose R is an appropriate ground for P. Then citing R is a good explanation for how you know that P. But we can also ask the question, how do you know that R is a good ground for P? That's a meta question. And the skeptic, the history of skepticism is littered with attempts to link the meta question to the first order question. So when the skeptic questions whether you know something and you cite a reason for it, that should be the end of the discussion. The only question is it a good reason? If it's not a good reason, of course it doesn't explain how you know. If it is a good reason, it does explain. We can ask another question though. How do you know whether it's a good reason? And the right response to a skeptic who substitutes that for the original question is to say, well, that's a different question. I don't have to know that it's a good reason in order for it to be a good reason. All that's required for me to know something is that there be a good reason for it, and I'm telling you that R is a good reason for it. You can ask the further question about how we know that it's a good reason for it, but that's a question that has no bearing on the first question that you ask. So I want to know, why did you change the subject? That's precisely what Moore is doing after he describes the proof strategy. We don't need to give a separate proof that the implication in B above is in fact a proof. Why? Because it launches an infinite regress. So think of how the skeptic, if you're not aware of the infinite regress arising, says, how do you know that P? And then you say, because R. And then the skeptic says, how do you know that if R is true, then P is true? And if you then give in to the skeptic's request for a further reason, you'll say, because Q. And then the skeptic will say, well, how do you know that if Q is true, then R is a good reason for P? How do you know that? And as soon as you get that third question, you should see the pattern here. The skeptic can do this from now till eternity, except for merely medical limitations like dying, because nobody lives forever. Anyway, that's the point Moore is making. There's a famous, this is Moore's pointing at levels confusion. And if you're interested, there's a really famous paper, an excellent paper on this topic related to skepticism by Bill Alston, William P. Alston, from 1980, Midwest Studies in Philosophy, called Levels Confusion in Epistemology. Back to Moore's article. Now, as soon as he tells you what the proof strategy is, he feels the need to talk about Kant, because he's already talked about Kant. So here's an objection to the proof strategy. Suppose you can prove that there are tables, plants, animals, stars, houses, etc. The Kantian objection is that it doesn't follow from the fact that there are three things to be met with in space that there is an external world. So notice this objection is an objection to the groundwork that Moore laid in trying to establish what needed to be shown to give a proof of an external world. He identified external world with things to be met with in space. The Kantian objection is, no, that's not right. Now, why does Kant object to the identification of the external world with things to be met with in space? The reason is Kant distinguishes between things in themselves and things for us. So Kant distinguishes between what he calls the noumenal and the phenomenal. The phenomenal is the stuff which we experience. So things to be met with in space are, by definition, phenomenal things, things from the phenomenal realm. But the external world idea is supposed to be a noumenal thing. It's not being questioned whether there is a world of experience. Of course there's a world of experience. That's the phenomenal realm. The question is there this other thing, the sort of thing that realists talk about? The world as it is in itself, independent of our experience of it. Now, Moore is rightly skeptical of this distinction. He says it's not clear what this could be, and then he engages in further analysis of the notion of a thing external to our mind and a thing to be met with in space. External to our minds is opposed to in our minds. In our minds is a technical use. One can have another person in mind. One doesn't have a pain in mind. It's in your toe or your stomach or something like that. So he's saying this is an unusual use of the phrase in our minds. The real meaning of in our minds is whether a certain proposition entails that someone is having an experience. He says that's the right way to understand this technical use. Having an experience isn't clear, but it means roughly being conscious or having a dream or something else, like the first two. So if you're hallucinating a pink rat, the pink rat is merely in your head, because hallucinating a pink rat entails that someone is having an experience. So the real relation, he says, between external to our minds and to be met with in space is this. If something is external to our minds, it doesn't follow that it's to be met with in space. Animal pains are external to our minds, but they're not to be met with in space. But if something is to be met with in space, it does follow that there is something external to our minds. Hence, the proof strategy above is acceptable, because we only needed that direction of connection between things to be met with in space and the external world. The Kantian distinction is thus based on a misunderstanding of the notion external to our minds and its relation to the phrase things to be met with in space. Now, I want to point out one further inelegancy in Kant's distinction. Kant's distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal, he knew himself to be incoherent. The reason for it is he took the phenomenal realm, things for us, to be structured by the nature of our minds, both in terms of space-time, which are the forms of intuition or sensation and the like, and the categories, which structure our thoughts. So things for us are either structured spatiotemporally, for sensations, or they're structured in terms of the categories of the mind. Things in themselves are thus free of both of these. The problem is that among the categories of the mind are the modes of existence. So Kant says the mode can be in the form of possibility, or as he puts it, contingency, necessity, and actuality. Something that's actual is both possible and contingently true. So we get actuality, possibility, and necessity. Mere possibility is the realm of imagination and the like. Actuality is, of course, the realm of existence itself. So now once you have those categories in mind, think about this notion of the noumenal realm and ask yourself, do the things in themselves actually exist? The Kantian answer, which he knew to be the case, had to be no, because existence is one kind of category of the mind. So if things in themselves actually existed, they would not be things in themselves. They would be things for us. They would be phenomenal entities. Kant then displays a characteristic vice of a particular kind of philosophical mind, which is you run up against a contradiction and then you pretend that it's not there, instead of going back and starting to give things up to render your outlook coherent again. You do something else. Sometimes it's engage in subterfuge. Sometimes it's you try some other way of getting people not to pay attention to the contradiction that you've just presented them with. But in any case, it's all intellectually dishonest. When Kant sees that his distinction between things in themselves and things for us leads to a contradiction, it's time to go back and start over. In any case, Moore doesn't give that response to Kant. He just says, look, let's be careful about the notion of things external to our minds and things in our minds and things to be met with in space and the like. And if you're careful about that, you'll see that the Kantian objection to our proof strategy can't be sustained. Okay, so let's ignore the objection to the proof strategy and just look at the proof strategy. We're going to prove that there are such things as tables, houses, plants, stars, animals, blah, blah, blah. And from the existence of things, it follows that there are things to be met with in space. So here's Moore's proof. And your experience should be that of deflation. I was looking for something fancy. I get something utterly trivial. What Moore does is hold up one hand and then another. So the premise is, here's one hand and here's another. The conclusion that follows from this is, therefore, there are external things. Your hands are no different a kind of thing than is a house or a plant or a star or a tree or any such thing. So the proof is very simple. Here's one hand, here's another, so there are things to be met with in space. You are deflated in response to hearing this proof, and so Moore continues. He says, why is this a proof? And so he defends the idea that it's a proof. He says, look, here's what's going on when you give a proof. There are three necessary conditions for a proof. First, the premise has to be different from the conclusion. It is. Second, the premises have to be known to be true. They are. Third, the conclusion really follows from the premises. Then he says, suppose you think there's some other condition that's also necessary for a proof that this purported proof doesn't meet. Tell me what it is. So Moore is saying, I take these three necessary conditions to be jointly sufficient. If you think they aren't jointly sufficient, tell me what else is needed. He then turns to extending the proof. That's not really all that important. So then the final section is, Why aren't you satisfied? I expect some of you might be satisfied, but it's a rather standard response to Moore's proof to be dissatisfied with it. Here's what he says. He gives some sources of possible dissatisfaction. What is wanted is a proof that the premises are true, or perhaps a general statement as to how any propositions such as those used as premises can be proved. Now notice this is a levels confusion again. What he said is, here's a proof. The premises I'm going to give you have to be ones that aren't the same as the conclusion, and they have to be known to be true. Being known to be true, of course, entails that they're true, but it also establishes an epistemological threshold for using a truth to derive a certain conclusion. So they not only have to be true, they have to be known to be true, and then the conclusion really has to follow from the premises. And so it's really this second claim that the first complaint is lodged against. What we want is a proof that the premises are true. And then you have to realize that that generated the infinite regress that Moore warned us about earlier. So you can't say that. So maybe it's not that we need a proof of the premises, but what we need is a general theory as to how any such premise can be proved to be true. And Moore's response is, that can't be given, and it shouldn't be thought to be necessary. If anything is necessary, it's only that conclusive or fairly well conclusive evidence can be given for them. So you don't need proof in order to have knowledge, but you got to have adequate evidence. So that's the first complaint and Moore's response to it. Here's another reason for dissatisfaction. This is in number 3. It might be thought that the absence of a proof of the premises, in the absence of a proof, the above proof is only a pseudo-proof. For in the absence of a proof of the premises, one doesn't know that the premises are true. So notice here again, we're trying to connect the notion of knowledge with having a proof. And you'd think it would be sufficient just to repeat the claim in 2. Moore does basically that, but in different words. First, there's no reason to think that this is true. And second, it can be shown to be mistaken. Though, of course, only by using premises which we can't know unless we know that there are external things. But we do know that there are external things. How do we know it? Look, here's one hand, here's another. He'll just raise his hands again. Now, people who are dissatisfied will not be satisfied with any of this. But what's important here in this last response is what has come to be called the Moorean shift. And it's a general pattern of thought that gives you a way to respond to the skeptic. So the skeptic intends to provide an argument that no matter what P is, you don't know it. So the skeptic says, maybe it's the kind of argument in 3. In order to know P, you have to have a proof. 2, you don't have a proof. So you don't know. That's a very simple argument for skepticism. The Moorean shift says, look, that's so obviously false. We know that one of the premises is false. Now, it's obvious to Moore that he doesn't have a proof, so the mistake has to be in the first premise. This is the Moorean shift. When you get an argument for a conclusion that looks crazy, instead of being moved by the argument that you were given and worrying about it, you just conclude, well, I guess that means one of the premises is faulty. So let's try to sort out which that is. That's the Moorean shift. The way I describe this Moorean shift is this way. Don't give up, the more obvious for the less obvious. Don't give up the more obvious for the less obvious. That's a good rule of thumb for how to deal with arguments by skeptics. Consider, for example, Humean arguments for skepticism. Doesn't matter what it's skepticism about or anything like that. But Hume was notoriously skeptical about inductive predictions. Hume said, for example, what reason do you have for thinking that the sun will come up tomorrow, except that it's always done so in the past? That's your only basis. But that doesn't guarantee the truth of the claim that the sun will come up tomorrow, because it only would get you the needed entailment if the future always resembles the past. And you're not entitled to that claim. So you now have an argument for inductive skepticism. The Morean shift strategy, the methodology that More asks us to follow, or is recommending that we follow, is this. Ask yourself, is the sophisticated Humean reasoning presented to you more or less obvious than the conclusion that he's trying to get you to disavow? So ask yourself, is it obvious that the sun's going to come up tomorrow? Yep, it is. Now look at the Humean reasoning. Is it at least as obvious as the claim that the sun will come up tomorrow? No, not even close. It's sophisticated, perhaps sophistical, abstract reasoning, but in any case, it's very complicated, and so there must be something wrong with it because it conflicts with something that's so obvious. That's the Morean shift at work. If you have time and inclination, you might then turn to the Humean reasoning and try to sit down and explain to yourself and others clearly where the argument goes false, where the argument commits a mistake. If you ask me, here's what I would say. Hume is rejecting the claim that we know something about the sun rising tomorrow because our evidential basis for it is inductive. But, he says, that's not an adequate basis for knowledge of the future unless the future resembles the past. What I say in response to Hume is, the strategy you're following is just a rejection of the idea that there's non-demonstrative support capable of generating knowledge. What you're saying is nothing counts as adequate knowledge, as adequate for knowledge, unless there are premises which it is one of, and the combination of the premises entails the claim in question. But that's precisely, of course, what the skeptic wanted you to think. There is no such thing as non-demonstrative knowledge. More's response to the claim that there's no such thing as knowledge apart from proof would be just to hold up one hand and then hold up the other and say, see, here are two things that I know. I know this is a hand and this is another. So your claim that there's no such thing as knowledge apart from demonstrative proofs is clearly to be rejected. That's the Morean shift. We turn then in the next lecture to his general summary of his epistemology. He was asked many times to talk about what lies at the heart of your epistemology, and in response, he writes a defense of common sense.